Oxford Economics Africa, an economic research group, has expressed concerns over South Africa's mining and manufacturing industries being under pressure in May following their improved performance throughout the first quarter. A statistics essays report released in June shows that seasonally adjusted mining production fell sharply by 3.8% compared to the previous month in May, and also compared to 1.5% increase during April and March. Now, annual output was down by 0.8%, most recently following last month's 3.2% expansion compared to a year ago. Oxford Economics Africa also says the country's economy will hardly grow at all in 2023, with real gross domestic product growth of 0.2% expected this year. However, less intense daytime load shedding during June should make for interesting output data in July. And so joining me from South Africa, I have Jannie Rossouw, visiting professor at Wits Business School. It's nice to have you join us, Professor, on the show.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to the viewers.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Now, mining production, according to the Oxford report, fell by 0.8% in May compared to April. How has this impacted mining companies? Looking at the employees too, how has this impacted them and the economy of the country in the past few months?
Well, in short, one should not pay too much attention to monthly changes in output from one month to the other. However, what is very disconcerting in South Africa is a general trend of very low or even no economic growth, while at the same time our population growth rate in South Africa is about 1.5% per annum. As a result of this, of course, the unemployment problem in South Africa increases annually. So the big challenge in South Africa is to get our economy growing at a rate at least commensurate with the growth rate of the South African population.
All right, so with this particular report by the Oxford Economics Africa, does it mean that we are likely to see some real GDP and economic stagnation in the year 2023, even of course the government does not get its economic measures right?
Well, when you talk about the GDP growth rate in South Africa, the important point to remember is that our economy has been in a slump for the last decade, with economic growth around 1% per annum, which is clearly not sustainable given widespread poverty in South Africa and giving unemployment in the country. So the policies of the South African government are clearly not working. What we need in South Africa is a policy rethink with much more deregulation and much more scope for the private sector.
All right, now looking at the mining industry, Professor, which minerals contributed the most to the annual decline, and which other minerals actually were said to have a steady market, and why is that so? I'd like you to also tie that to the manufacturing industry too.
Well, of course, with both mining and manufacturing, it's a hodgepodge with some improvements and some declines. But what is more disconcerting, especially in mining, is the problems that we experience with rail traffic in South Africa and with our South African ports, where exports cannot be handled by the rail infrastructure, and where South African ports are not up to scratch in terms of handling the volumes that South Africa wishes to export. So it is really a hodgepodge of problems, with some sectors doing better, some sectors declining, but a much more structural, fundamental problem resulting in the problems that we see in South Africa.
All right, now, Professor Rossouw, with these sharp declines that we are reading and recording in the country, could you actually brief us on the major concerns for the South African government and for the Oxford Economics Africa in terms of the key assumptions driving these fears that you have just expressed?
Well, the first thing in South Africa, of course, is that inflation got out of hand. Our central bank did take the necessary steps, and inflation has started declining in recent months. So the first challenge is to get inflation back to the midpoint of the inflation target range. And for that, we need appropriate monetary policy. We have serious fiscal problems in South Africa. Government revenue is not performing in accordance with the budgeted revenue of the South African government. As a result, we are heading for a large fiscal deficit this year. And then lastly, increasing socialist tendencies of the South African government. These tendencies result in less investment in the economy. And with less investment, there is, of course, less growth and there is less employment in our economy. So the government should rethink its policies to support, for instance, small businesses, to get the economy growing, and to make sure that South Africa becomes an attractive investment destination.
But then, Professor, talking about rising inflation, what were the past measures that the South African Reserve Bank put in place, or what did they do to actually stem the tide of inflation in the country? We've seen other countries raise interest rates, as it were. What were the other things that the South African Reserve Bank did? And like you said they need to rethink on these policies. In what areas do you think they should be focusing when coming up with policies to mitigate the issues of inflation?
The South African Reserve Bank tightened monetary policy, and we see that in terms of an increase in interest rates. So interest rates went up. What the South African Reserve Bank did well was to start raising interest rates in a timely fashion, whereas some other central banks in the world fell behind the curve, and whilst they thought inflation was transitionary, inflation continued to increase. The South African Reserve Bank did not make a similar mistake, and as a result, South Africa has been successful in turning around the trajectory of inflation in a more timely fashion than other countries. Interest rates will, of course, remain at current levels until such time as inflation is heading back to the midpoint of the inflation target range, which is 4.5% per annum.
All right, Professor, earlier on you talked about the lack of economic development in the country. Does it have to do with the major pullback in investments in the mining and the manufacturing industries? And if so, what impact level and what can be done? What is the impact level rather, and what can be done to actually improve this situation in terms of investors' confidence and what they're able to plug into these critical sectors?
Well, unfortunately, the South African government has not done much to improve the situation in South Africa. We have a president, Mr. Ramaphosa, in South Africa, that is seemingly afraid of taking decisions. Whenever there's a crisis in South Africa, he appoints another commission of inquiry or committee of inquiry. He is not, he does not tend to take the right decisions in a timely fashion. And until such time as we have clear leadership at the most senior level in South Africa, we will continue to muddle through in the way we muddle through at the moment, with low or no expectations of continued economic growth. So we have to blame it on the current ANC tripartite government alliance, and we have to blame it on a president that's afraid to take the necessary decisions.
All right. Now, what kind of decisions are you talking about when you say that President Ramaphosa is actually not taking the right decisions and not taking them in a timely manner? So I'd like you to just do a bit of evaluating part of the policies or the measures that the president put in place that you feel does not go down well with you. And of course, it's not actually springing up any economic benefit to the country.
Well, examples that come to mind immediately. The first one is reducing the size of the cabinet that he's been promising the last 5 years. And to the contrary, he's not only kept a bloated cabinet, but he's also appointed 4 ministers and 4 deputy ministers in the presidency, which the country clearly does not need. We even now have a minister of electricity, while we also have a minister of private enterprises to look after Eskom and the minister of mineral and energy affairs. So he's increased cabinet rather than to decrease cabinet. At the same time, for many years we've had big problems with our visa structure in South Africa for foreign visitors. He's promised 5 years ago to fix that, and that has not been fixed. And with Eskom, we've had load shedding now for 15 years with no solution in mind, but he should use energy to fix Eskom and to make sure that we get deregulation so that South Africa can have uninterrupted electricity supply, because we will not see economic growth and the necessary investment until we are assured of uninterrupted power supply. And in this latter matter, it will be necessary to rely on private sector electricity supply, which the government has been very reluctant to admit.
So does this now mean that these misplaced interventions by governments, as you have said, could actually scare foreign investors away who may want to refocus their investments in other countries?
Yes, unfortunately, other countries are more attractive investment destinations than South Africa, because the South African government keeps on making the same mistakes. And until such time as these mistakes are rectified, we will not see the necessary investment in South Africa.
Okay, Professor. Now, according to the reports, Oxford Economics Africa also indicated that South Africa's Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index dropped further below the neutral 50-point level in June, averaging about 48.9 index points during the second quarter. Now, while it actually averaged 50 in the first quarter. So should we expect further decline in the sector or in these two sectors in the next quarter?
Well, of course, many sectors of the South African economy doing their best to adjust to unreliable electricity supply with our stages of load shedding increasing all the time. And until such time as the various business sectors in South Africa adjusted to unreliable electricity supply, we might continue to see a decline in business activity.
So then, if you are to advise the government on strategies that should be taken to help the economy evolve or revolve, as it were, what would be the critical statements or recommendations that you'd be proffering to the government?
The first and most critical recommendation is to make sure that we have uninterrupted electricity supply in South Africa, and then we have to rely on the private sector to make sure that we can get that. And unfortunately, the South African government is very reluctant to rely on the private sector and to use the private sector, especially in electricity supply, because we have this big social tendency in the South African government.
All right, thank you so much, Jannie, Professor Jannie Rossouw, visiting professor at Wits Business School, for joining us on the show. Thank you so much.